I am very excited about tonight's guest. We are so pleased to be closing the program year with a presentation from Dr. Deborah Tannen, well known for her work in linguistics, which has had an influence in how the public looks at relationships in a variety of settings. Dr. Tannen holds the distinguished rank of university professor in the linguistics department at Georgetown University. She has been McGraw Distinguished Lecturer at Princeton and has twice been a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. Among her 26 books, half of which she authored and half co-edited or edited, the best known outside of the academy are books like You Just Don't Understand, Women and Men in Conversation. These were all New York Times bestsellers, some at #1. That one was translated into 31 languages. You're Wearing That, about mothers and grown daughters. Definitely can relate to that one. You Were Always Mom's Favorite, about sisters, and Talking from 9 to 5. Dr. Tannen's most recent book is Finding My Father, Her Century-Long Journey from World War I, Warsaw, and My Quest to Follow. This is more than a memoir. The book provides moving insight into numerous themes like immigration, antisemitism, modernization, and the impact of family secrets on family members. Dr. Tannen has been a guest on television and radio, news and information shows. Just this past Sunday, you might have heard her interview with Shankar Vedantam on NPR's Hidden Brain. And and she's also been featured in most major newspapers and magazines. And if that wasn't enough, her play, An Act of Devotion, is included in the Best American Short Plays 1993 to 1994. Tonight, Dr. Tannen will talk about her scholarly career as well as the impact this work has had on the public. And she'll also talk about her most recent book, which is highly personal and certainly had an impact on me. And I can see more and more of my book members joining us. So we have some logistics here. Dr. Tannen really likes to see people. I know people are eating dinner. Don't be shy. If you can leave your video on, that would be great. Please hold your questions to the end. We want to leave the chat function open for the co-hosts have to get in touch with each other. And also when people chat during a presentation, it can distract the members of the audience as well as the speaker. So hold the questions to the end, and I'll give some more requests regarding how we want to do Q&A later on. So Dr. Tannen, it's all yours now.
Thank you, and thank you all who put your cameras on. It's a lot easier to talk when I see people and feel like I'm talking to people. But I did say one time I was talking to a group and people had their cameras on, but there was actually a strip on the top where I saw most clearly. Two of them got up and walked away. So feel free if you want to get up and walk away, but then turn your camera off. Yeah, so it's really a pleasure to be here. Although I'm a linguist in principle, I'm often mistaken for an anthropologist, and I'm always flattered by that. Very shortly after coming to Georgetown and getting my degree, I stopped going to linguistics meetings, LSA meetings, because there was all stuff, formal stuff that wasn't really that relevant to my work. And I began going to AAA meetings and didn't miss one really until just recent years that I've getting older and traveling is more challenging. But so I really do see myself as an anthropologist that way, and I'm definitely a member of SLA, Society of Linguistic Anthropology. Yeah, so I thought I would talk 15 or 20 minutes about moving from academic writing to general audience writing. And then 15 or 20 minutes maybe about my book about my father, because I want to leave lots of time for you to ask questions. So, because I'm not sure what of all this is going to interest you. So that way we'll leave lots of time for me to answer any questions you have. And it could be about either one. So how did this all start? I actually started thinking about writing for general audiences while I was still a grad student. And in fact, I sold an article to a women's magazine, and it was about something about indirectness in conversation, I think. And I was so excited. I think they paid me $50 for it. And then they never published it. So that was a very interesting, a very instructive introduction to the world of commercial publishing. There's a lot of unpredictability in that. Then I wrote my dissertation, which was about, and so I could say why. Why was I thinking of doing that? I sometimes say that I wanted to write a book that my mother could read. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. They were both born in Europe. My mother in Minsk, my father in Warsaw. My father was an intellectual. He quit high school at 14 and went to work full-time in the garment industry in New York, but he went to law school at night, became a lawyer. This is part of what the book is about. Took him a long time to actually practice law for various reasons, but he did finally open his own law practice. But he was an intellectual, what my mother was not. And I really never saw my mother read a book. She only really read newspapers and magazines. My father could read my academic articles, but my mother never, I don't know, wouldn't, couldn't, wasn't interested. So it was really kind of second nature to me to want to talk to people who were not academics. Also, I was 30 when I started grad school in linguistics, so I had not automatically gone into academia. I had lived in Greece. I taught English as a second language. Then I taught remedial writing, and had lots of real world experience before I got into the academic world. So it just seems kind of obvious to me that I should talk not only to academics, and I also like to write, and that probably is part of it. I was a literary type. I was wrote poetry and short stories, and I was, editor of a literary magazine in college, and so I think the idea of writing, another kind of writing, was intriguing to me. Actually, also throughout grad school, I was sending my poems and short stories out to magazines, and they were always getting rejected. And when I sent academic articles to journals, they got accepted. So that was kind of a signal that I was maybe better suited to that. So I did give up trying to publish my poems and short stories. So when I got my degree, my dissertation had been about New York Jewish conversational style. I didn't in the dissertation talk of it as New York Jewish. I talked of it as high involvement style compared to a style I called high considerateness. People who put an emphasis on showing your involvement versus putting an emphasis on not imposing. And that grew out of the study I did that led to my dissertation. I had set out to analyze a 2.5-hour Thanksgiving dinner conversation among 6 people. 3 were New York Jews, 2 were Californians, 1 was British. And I thought I was going to look at every individual's conversational style and the effect that it had on the conversation. But it turned out that I could really only talk about the style of the New York Jews because the Californians and the British women had a hard time getting the floor. They could get the floor and they might hold it for a long time, like telling a story, but they couldn't really be part of the give and take, and I couldn't really see what their style was. These are all my friends, and they're all still my friends. I actually had the 2 Californians tape their own conversations so that I could maybe use that, but that was just dyadic, and so it wasn't really comparable. So as soon as I got to Georgetown, and I'm very grateful to the person who suggested this. Someone told me that there was a special issue edited by Joshua Fishman of the sociology of language, I guess he was editing. Yeah, International Journal of the Sociology of Language. But he was doing an issue on Jewish languages. And someone just came up to me and suggested, why don't you put something in there? And that was my coming out as New York Jewish, because I had not talked about it as New York Jewish. So that was accepted. And then I had something about New York Jewish style. I sent it to every publication that had New York in the title. New York Magazine, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times. And I was lucky that New York Magazine wrote back and said, yes, they would be interested in something written for a general audience about that material. And so I did it. I wrote something that seemed like it would be appropriate for that, and they took it. So that was really my start. I was then contacted by someone at Vogue magazine who said, could you do this for gender? Gender was not my specialty at all, but I took a crack at it. And this is really revealing, and it's a lesson I don't think I entirely learned. I wish I had learned it. So I sent her a draft, and she said that was fine. And then I started revising it. And I sent her another draft, and I said, forget the one I sent you, use this one. And she said, no, the one you sent me first was better. And I just had a similar experience in my book about my father, so hopefully I'll mention it when I get to that. I know we all talk about how important revising is, but you can revise things and destroy them, make it worse. So that was how I started, and then I took those articles and got an agent. How did I get an agent? I was then publishing with a just starting up publishing company called Ablex. By the way, all the major publishers had turned down my proposal to publish my dissertation as a book. Oxford didn't want it, Cambridge didn't want it. But this guy who was running Ablex, it was brand new, and he was looking for things to publish. So he took it. Incidentally, I had the satisfaction of the Cambridge editor telling me that she regretted not having taken it. And they eventually published another academic book of mine. So I got an agent by asking the person who was running Ablex, did he know any agents? He had some connections to he was on the board of some commercial publisher. He suggested an agent. And she made suggestions about how I could write a proposal, and she shopped it around to editors. I'm not going to tell you the whole horrible story about my first book for general audiences, but it was a tremendous saga, and why I didn't give up, I cannot say. I guess I was obsessed with the idea that I was going to do this, but I'll try to summarize it as quickly as I can. So with her, I came up with a proposal that was quite detailed. Then I got an editor. She didn't like the proposal, but she had some idea about what I might write. And so I came up with something, and I had an editor. I was very excited because he had been the editor for Gregory Bateson, and so I thought I actually chose him, even though the offer wasn't that great. We're not talking about so much money. I don't know, however much it was not a lot. And so we talked about, I met him in New York. We talked about what it should be. I wrote a whole bunch for him. I went to New York to meet him again, and his office was all boxes, and he said he's leaving and he's going to come introduce me to the editor who's going to take over. She read what I'd written for him. She read the proposal. She didn't think it was any good. She said, why don't you write? Just write. Don't censor yourself. Just write. Get your ideas out there, and then we can shape it. And she said, either do half the book or do the whole book. So I can be very gung-ho. I wrote a 300-page manuscript, sent it to her, and her response was to send me a carton of self-help books. and a letter saying, you obviously don't know how to write a book for general audiences. Read these books to see how a self-help book should be structured. I called up a friend, invited myself over to dinner, and sobbed, just sobbed. And I decided to just sort of put it aside for a while. And it was a good thing because that editor left and I got a new editor who read those 300 pages, read the 75 pages I had written for the guy, read the proposal, didn't like any of them. And we talked about what new material I might do. And I wrote 3 chapters and she thought it was fine. And I wrote 3 more and she thought it was fine. This is the book, That's Not What I Meant. It is not the book you just didn't understand. So I was heaved a sigh of relief. It's really much more like an academic book than the style I ended up developing. So I had written now 6 chapters. She's fired. I get a new editor. That editor doesn't like those 6 chapters, doesn't like the 300 pages, doesn't like the 75 pages, doesn't like the proposal. And I could hear from the way she was talking to me that she thought I was a loser, that she'd been stuck with this person who obviously didn't know how to write, had been through all these editors, was incapable of writing anything any good. And so I called my agent and cried. And my agent said, she apologized. She said she really should have moved me to another press sooner. She went back to one of the editors who had made an offer that I had not accepted. I had 3 to choose from initially. She showed her those 6 chapters. She thought it was fine. I wrote 3 or 4 more. She thought it was fine, and it was published without any changes. So all of this shows the vagaries of publishing in commercial presses. And I think it's even crazier now, honestly. So that was my first book. That's Not What I Meant. The book You Just Don't Understand has a big drama behind it too, but I won't tell you that one. It's not quite as horrible. Almost, almost. All right, I'll tell you just briefly. So the same editor, we agreed my next book would be about women and men. That was the chapter that got the most interest from the book, That's Not What I Meant. But she said, it was around the time that Hawking's book about time, was very popular. He said, really, write it more like an academic book. Don't have all those cute little subheadings. It makes your books seem like cotton candy. You're much too smart for your books to seem like cotton candy. So I suppressed all these little cute subheadings that came to my mind, and I added all the academic trappings that she thought it should have. And then apparently her higher ups read it and thought it wasn't any good. It was too stodgy. And somebody suggested that we pull it and then I write it more like the book. That's Not What I Meant. And I could choose between doing it within a few months or waiting a year. And I didn't want to wait a year. So I got up every morning at about 5 and worked on it from 7 to 9 before I went on and did all the other things that I was doing. I was giving papers at conferences. I was on the LSA program committee. It was the first time my back went out when I did that. And I was supposed to work within the copy edited manuscript. So it was all these cross-outs and additions. So those are the sagas behind those books. About the 2 kinds of writing, I often say that when I write for academic audiences, I can't say a lot of what I know because I can't prove it. And when I write for general audiences, I can't say a lot of what I know because it would take too long to explain. One example sticks in my mind. I was asked by a magazine to write something or other, and I was thrilled that there was one example that would illustrate all my major points. I had been riding in a taxi with a taxi driver. This was for You Just Don't Understand. We were on our way to somewhere or other. He asked where I'm going. I said, it's going to be on television because he was taking me to Rockefeller Plaza. What are you going to do there? I wrote this book. What's it about? Conversations between women and men. And he looked at me in the rearview mirror and he said, my wife and I have good communication. But sometimes when she talks to me, I just don't answer. So I didn't think that sounded like such good communication. And I asked why. And he said, well, sometimes what she says, it just doesn't make any sense. So I asked for an example. He said, well, like the other day, we're watching television and she says to me, what shall my brother do? Her brother's 35. Why should I tell him what to do? So I loved this example because there were so many things that I thought I could comment on. That he thought it was fine just to watch television. She wanted to talk. He thought, what should my brother do, was giving him advice. I doubt she was going to go give him advice and other things. So I wrote this up, very, very pleased with it. And the editor said, you cannot have a whole article about one example. You must have a different example for every point you want to make. So I made up examples. So that's an example of how I can't, so I felt that I couldn't use this elegance because of the requirement. And I did definitely learn that I had to get from point to point more quickly. Both in the writing and certainly in the speaking. I learn when I'm on television or being interviewed, the first thing out of my mouth has to be the most important point. I couldn't build up to a point because if I did, good chance I'd be cut off before I got to the point. The last thing I'll say is, I think the most frustrating thing about doing two kinds of writing, it's a little bit like having two sets of friends that hate each other. I frequently hear dismissive remarks about popular writing from academics. I remember one time the Cambridge editor, not that one I mentioned, but next one, came to see me in my office, and his first question was, how much money was I making with these books? And the second question was, what are you doing for real work? At the same time, popular editors have contempt for academics, and they tend to, anything I wrote that they didn't like, they say it's too academic. I feel like it's a label that they've stuck on me that I have to constantly prove I can overcome. And I have some examples where the editor, it's actually happened with my book before this one about women friends. And she said, this section is too academic. You're talking about patterns, but you're not talking about women in particular. And I realized she was right, and I revised it to have it all about women. And she said, now it's good. Well, why was that less academic? I think that just sort of came to her mind as something that would explain why something I wrote was wanting. I am keeping my eye on the time, and I think that's about as much time as I should spend on that one topic. Let me spend about 15 minutes, maybe 20, talking about this most recent book. I'll show you. It's called Finding My Father. That's a picture of my father and me on the cover. I love the cover, and I'll tell you the story behind the cover. They asked me, early on, I did not get to say much about the cover, but now I get to at least express myself. They asked me early on, what did I want for the cover? And I said, a picture of me and my father when I'm a kid. And then I couldn't find one. And I had none in the house. My sisters couldn't find any. I'm the youngest of 3 sisters, so any pictures that I had were big family pictures. As some of you know, if you either are or have multiple kids, the youngest one does not have a whole lot of pictures, and especially not alone with the parents. But I knew that my father had left a lot of pictures. My father passed away in 2006. And I have everything. In fact, if I turn this laptop around, my office is still piled with cartons of my father's stuff because he was a hoarder. And I am too, so that's part of the mess here. But he saved everything, every piece of paper that came into his life. He was an organized hoarder. I'm a disorganized hoarder, but everything was labeled and cartons and cartons and cartons. But I knew that one of those cartons was pictures, photographs. I'd seen it. And I took this office apart 3 times, every corner of it. The pictures weren't there. So I gave up, and they actually designed a cover and put it in the catalog. It was a New York City picture, a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge. And then I was in my corner of my office that does not have anything stored as far as I knew. It's where I do more of my academic stuff. I was preparing a syllabus for a class, and I wanted a certain article that I knew I had, and I couldn't find it. So I'm looking through all these piles, and I was finally going to give up and go to the computer and try to find it online. And then I said, no, I have it. I am going to find it. And I went back, and I turned to the other side where I hadn't really looked for a long time, the other side of the computer. And I start going through that pile, and there's the box of pictures upside down. My father saw it, he would turn over in his grave. Somehow I had it in there, it got turned upside down. And luckily, my father had kept all the pictures in plastic bags with labels, so they weren't harmed. And I went through every one of those pictures, and there was one. It was about this big, one picture. It was my father and mother and my sister, one of my sisters and me, but I was under my father, and the sister was under my mother. So we could cut them out, and that's how I got that picture. So it's a long story, but makes me very glad that I got that picture. That was the hardest book to write of any book I have ever written. It's been 7 years. It was 7 years between this and my previous book, which horrified me because I generally 3 or 4 years between books was a lot. And I just I didn't know how to write it. I didn't know how to structure it. A lot of people thought that it was self-evident. The reason I was having trouble writing it is that it was emotional, which it was, but that wasn't the reason. It was, the material was so different. I knew that I wanted to start with my relationship with my father when I was a kid, and I adored him, because I knew that I had to make readers care about my father. Why should they care? And I thought, well, maybe if they see him in relation to me, they would understand why I felt about him the way I did. My father was raised in a Hasidic family in Warsaw, and he had astonishingly detailed memories of life in Warsaw. He was 6 when he left. Until he was 6, he lived in his mother's father's household. So that was his devout Hasidic grandfather, devout Hasidic grandmother, his mother, who was the second oldest of 16 siblings, 9 of them still living there. And you heard that I wrote a play. It's actually about going back to Poland with my father. It's full of his memories of his childhood in Poland, juxtaposed with my memories of my childhood with him. And it wasn't until the play was done that I realized it was all things that had happened before he was 6. It was from that household. When he was 6 or 7, his mother was chosen to establish and be principal of the first school for Hasidic girls in Warsaw. And so she set up the school. My father and his sister, just a year older, went with her, and they lived in the school for 6 more years. And by the way, that was a modern building with an elevator, electric lights, and it frustrated my father until he died at the age of 98 that he could not convince the children in the street in Brooklyn that his home in Poland had elevator and electric lights. So there was all this stuff about my father's memory of Poland, and that could have been a book in itself. And I kind of wanted it to be a book in itself. But what was important to my father was all the jobs he had done. When he sat down he retired at 70. So at that point, he had been a lawyer for 50 years, but between when he graduated law school and at the age of 19 until he was 50, he did all these other things. Part of it was because of the Depression. Some of it was because of mistakes that he made, bad decisions he made. I'll say a little bit about that. But when he retired and he decided he would write about his life, what he did was list all the jobs he had done, all the work he had done, and it came to 68 different jobs and types of work. And he regarded the length of that list, I think, with a combination of pride, because he had done whatever he had to do to support his family, and regret, because I should tell you also, he handed me journals that he had kept before he married. He was a writer by nature. He was always sitting at his desk writing. And he had kept these journals. And I always knew that my father worked in a factory, went to law school at night, but I didn't really know what that entailed when I read his journals, where he describes it. He would get up at 6 or something in the morning, get to the factory. He would work a 10-hour day with a half-hour for lunch. He did not have time for dinner before he had to run to law school to take his classes. By the time he got home, it was like 10 o'clock at night. He would eat dinner and then study the law books and maybe sleep 3 or 4 hours and do the same thing the next day. You know, it's so much about what you hear your parents say. It's reduced to a nugget, and you don't really know what that entails. And when I read that, I thought, why didn't I ever ask him? What did that mean? What was that like? But I didn't. Luckily, I had that. But he really thought that once he finished law school, he was doing that, he was sacrificing and doing that. He was going to make his living as a lawyer. He was sole support of his mother and sister. He had no father. His father had died of tuberculosis when he was 2. And his father had come down with tuberculosis when he was 2 and left the family because they were living in this one room in his grandfather's house. And so his mother didn't want the kids exposed to the tuberculosis in this one tiny room. And so he never knew his father. So he felt it was his responsibility to support his mother and sister. His mother, right, she had been a principal of a school in Warsaw. She could not get work in this country. For a couple of years, she worked as a matron, whatever that means, in the Hebrew National Orphan Home. It was out in Tuckahoe, New York, and my father and his sister boarded with rabbi's wife, widow, but that apparently didn't work out. His mother was kind of difficult. I suspect it didn't work out because of that. And she tried working in a bank because she spoke a lot of languages, so she was going to have, they hired her because she spoke several languages. But when she said that she couldn't work on Saturday, they fired her, and apparently I've heard many similar stories since then. So she really couldn't support the family, and my father felt that he had to do that. One of the things I learned in writing this book that I had not realized, my father regretted things. He always talked about regret, terrible regrets he had, mistakes he made. I didn't know until I read the things he had written that his mother did not want him to quit high school. She was against it. She tried everything she could to talk him out of it. But what he wrote was, what's the one thing she wouldn't do or couldn't do was stop complaining that she didn't know how they were going to eat and she didn't know how they were going to pay the rent. So he felt that he had no choice but to take that over. So I had a chapter about his jobs. I have a chapter about his memories of Warsaw. And my first draft of the book was over 400 pages because I had huge amounts of each of these things. And of course, I had to cut them down. I remember, and I thought I was just picking the most interesting jobs because after he listed these 68 jobs, he recorded or wrote detailed descriptions of each one, how he came to do it, what the work was, people he worked with, injustices he suffered, triumphs, because he did a good job, which was usually writing. And I think I got it down to about 12. And an editor said, you can't have that many. So I think now I had it down to about 3 of the main ones. And then there was a whole dramatic story. There was a woman that my father might have married instead of my mother. They talked about it. It was not a secret. I'm calling her Helen. That's a pseudonym. But he told me at one time, I have 200 cassette tapes of interviews with him. He loved to talk about the past. I loved to listen. I missed him constantly as a kid. The way I put it, the strongest presence I felt in the house was his absence. He was the parent that I felt an affinity with. He was the one I felt understood me. And he was never there. So now he's retired. He has all this time that he's willing to just sit with me for hours. And once I had said that I was going to write a book, then I was willing to take hours during the day. I would never have done that otherwise. So in one of these conversations, and I'm asking him about Helen, because both my parents talked about her, and I referred to her as his other girlfriend. And he said, your mother wasn't my girlfriend. Helen was my girlfriend. And then he said another time, and my mother said it too, again, there's no secrets. Had he known that Helen was not a virgin, he would have married her. What? How could that have happened? So I was very intrigued by Helen. And some of you may have read this. I had an article in the Washington Post based on it was just a couple weeks ago, and they had a lot of pictures of my parents with it. But I kind of zero in on that Helen story in that piece. So, you know, why did he marry my mother and not Helen? My father said he had kept Helen's letters, and he said, I don't know where they are, but if I could find them, I'd give them to you. He gave me everything. He knew I was going to write this book, and he felt I could put anything in it that I wanted, he said. So he said, if I can find them, I'll give them to you. So one time I was at their apartment. They lived in a condo in Westchester. And he said he was going to go down to the storage room. And I said, I'll go with you. After we got there and he got whatever he was looking for, I said, why don't we look for those letters? And he said, sure. And as I said, he was very organized. So we looked at everything, and it didn't take that long because everything was labeled. But we had pretty much looked everywhere and they weren't there, and I was disappointed. There was one carton left. It was on the highest shelf in the farthest corner. And I reached for it and pulled it toward me so I could look in it, and I heard a plop. So I reached behind the carton and pulled out a manila envelope, and there were the letters. And not only all her letters, all of them still neatly and folded up in their envelopes with their stamps, but all these typed pages. He had also kept copies of many of the letters he wrote to her. So I had this record of their relationship, starting with detailed letters that they wrote to each other the night they met in the Catskills. It was very much a part of the culture there that the Catskills, if you had a few days, whatever vacation you had, time off, you went to the Catskills. And you know, this was the Depression. They were destitute. Helen and her friend, they hitchhiked because there was no money. And yet they could afford to spend the weekend at this camp, as they called it. And that fascinates me because there's nothing like that now that I'm aware of. So I won't go into all the details now because I want to mention a few other things and again, give you a chance to ask anything you want. But that I wanted to tell the story of this relationship and what I learned from reading the letters. And so I sat down and pretty much I put them in order. Only when I was writing the book, I didn't do it right away. At first, I was just sort of picking out letters at random. I put them in chronological order and read through them. And I wrote out the things I thought were important, and I ended up with about 100 pages that I thought were important. So that was another whole thing that I had to get somehow. How's that going to get in there? Another thing I thought was worth telling. My father's mother, as I mentioned, was one of at least 16 siblings. A sister of her told her kids there were 18. My father said his recollection was there were 23 born, of whom 16 lived to adulthood. I can list 18 if I include babies that died that my father mentioned, but 13 whose stories I could tell, and again, 9 that my father lived with. The difference between the sisters and the brothers was fascinating. The brothers didn't get secular education. They only went to study Talmud, which my father also did, from the age of 4. All day, 6 days a week, went to what they call Cheder, studying religious studies. The brothers all went to religious school until they were old enough to rebel, and then they stopped. So they didn't really speak Polish very well, and they didn't have any secular education. My father spoke Polish to his aunts and Yiddish to his uncles and his grandmother. My grandmother and her sisters were all educated. Astonishing. I mean, we are talking about women born into a Hasidic family in Warsaw in the 1880s, the late 1880s. So my grandmother, as I said, ran the school. One of her sisters was a physicist who studied with Einstein in Zurich, had an affair with him. And I understand that was not unusual, talking to people who wrote biographies of Einstein. She came to the United States shortly after my father did in 1920. Einstein later came to the United States and moved to Princeton. She moved to Princeton to be with him, and their affair rekindled. She became pregnant by him. She believed that he would marry her after his wife died. I think she moved there after his wife died. But he didn't, and she was apparently devastated and moved to California. But I did find, actually, when there was a biography of Einstein I wrote to the author, and I said, have you come across any reference to this aunt of mine? He immediately sent me a link. In the Einstein archive is a handwritten letter of recommendation written by Einstein about this, my great aunt, in which he says I've known her very well for many years. She's a very talented, brilliant physicist, and she is a wonderful educator, but she never in this country got a job as a teacher. The last thing I have from her is a letter that she wrote from California, from Los Angeles, to her sister. This is another sister who was a dentist. She had become a dentist in Poland and trained in the United States, and was the first woman dentist in Newark, New Jersey, and periodontist, first woman periodontist. So she was close in age to Dora, the physicist, and I have a letter that she wrote why do I have a letter that Dora wrote to her sister? God only knows, because my father had everything and he kept it, but I have that letter, and in it she says, I have found a way to support myself. I'm crocheting baby jackets. And if I can break into the Hollywood crowd, I know I can do better with this than teaching. My father's recollection was that she became a governess. So I think what she did was teach private kids. Another of those sisters was a linguist, by which they meant she spoke a lot of languages and studied languages. My father visited her. She was also in Switzerland on the way from Warsaw to the United States. And she told him that she spoke 10 languages and knew about a dozen more, somewhat. She, like this one more sister I'll mention, was a devout communist. And my father, when he came to the United States at the age of 12, he told me, was already self-identified as a communist, an atheist, and a Zionist. how did he, and I asked him, when did you become a communist? At the age of 6. When did you become an atheist? At the age of 6. It was the influence of his mother's youngest sister, only 6 years older than he was, but he adored her. He followed her around. She was kind to him. His mother was not. She protected him from his mother. And she was a devout communist, a teenager, caught up in the Bolshevik Revolution. So much of his life reflects that he lived 100 years, almost the entire 20th century. So these are it was World War I. He lived through World War I in Warsaw. World War I, that massive immigration of Eastern European Jews to the United States. He came at the tail end of it, 1920. 1921 was the first Immigration Act, 1924, the second one, and then the doors basically were shut. But this aunt, 6 years older than he called her, she was Aunt Magda, was a communist. And so she stayed in Poland. She did not leave. Many of the others either died or came to the United States. The linguist died of tuberculosis. Because of her devout communism, she went to Russia to help the revolution. And I think she had a lover who was sent to Siberia, and she followed him there, and the tuberculosis came back and she died. But Magda was in Poland when the Germans came in for World War II. She had been in jail for 8 years as a communist. The jail she was in was near the Russian border. And when the Germans were coming to that town, the guards ran away and the townspeople let the prisoners out, and she made it across the border to Russia. She survived in Russia. Again, very long story. She became an officer in the Polish army in Poland, was an officer in the army when they came back to Poland. And she had a very high position in the Polish government. So she contacted the family in this country after World War II, when they were able to make contact. They didn't have a lot of contact during the McCarthy era because it was too dangerous. But when it seemed more comfortable, safer, she came to visit. We visited there. I spent a month there with her and her husband. Each had their own car and chauffeur. They had a housekeeper who cooked and cleaned, about which she commented, "This is not what we fought for," but she enjoyed it anyway. And so that was another sister. So all these sisters, so I wanted to write about that too. Everything that I'm mentioning to you, some editor somewhere told me leave it out. But I wanted all these things, and everything I've mentioned to you, someone has told me, and usually a few people, that's their favorite part. Some people say, I love that part about all those sisters. They're so fascinating, such fascinating women. And some people say, oh, the part about Poland is just magical. And then other people say, oh, that thing about the letters. But that was the challenge. I really didn't know how to handle all these different things. So I have talked a little more than I said I would, but only a couple minutes more. So you know the outlines, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about either topic.
So thank you so much.
Emma, you pointing something? Want to talk?
It's Martha.
Unmute yourself and tell me if there's something wrong.
All the time. Okay. Martha, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just want to. This is great. If we're not as crowded as we thought it would be, so you can raise your hand and just go ahead. If people want to put something in the chat, I'll batch them. But go ahead, and if things start to pile up, another thing you can do is just use the raise hand function under participants.
By the way, I just realized what was confusing me. The speaker I have here, if it isn't used for a long time, it shuts itself off. So I talked all that time and thought that it had no work to do, and it would shut itself off.
Oh,
But
Okay, so, all right.
So Deborah, my question is the following. I'm about not quite 50% done with the book.
Thank you.
And well, I'm really enjoying it, but I'm one of three sisters. Well, my younger sister died, so
I know that.
yeah, two remaining sisters. But anyway, I was floored when you mentioned Ellen or Helen. And I mean, I understand that it was known, that your mother mentioned it. My question to you is, and this might be in the latter part of the book that I haven't gotten to, did you get any reaction from your two sisters about it?
That is a great question. My two sisters have diametrically different reactions to the book, to Helen, to everything. My oldest sister, 8 years older than I am, feels this also tended to idealize my father and be very critical of my mother.
Okay.
Even more than I am.
Mm-hmm.
My middle sister was quite critical of my father and much, much more generous toward my mother. So that sister did not like, it's not that she minded about Helen, she didn't like the way I was portraying my mother. Because the point there of that whole Helen story is, and if you saw the piece in the Washington Post, I talk about this. I got it in my head that Helen would have been a better choice for my father. Now, the fact that that would have meant I wouldn't exist, that didn't enter into it. But and from her letters, yes, she was an intellectual as he was. She was sensitive. She seemed in many ways like she would have been. She was a lovely person. But my sister was not happy with the way it was put. But I mean, I'm very close to both my sisters. I sent them both copies of the book. My oldest sister read every draft of every chapter and gave me wonderful comments. My middle sister is not that interested in that stuff. In one of my books, I mentioned, the sister's book I mentioned.
Right.
It's a funny story, but I'll tell you it quickly. Sorry, I tend to free associate here. My mother was very upset that I thanked everybody in my book except my middle sister. And I said, but she didn't do anything. I thanked my sister Naomi for reading chapters. And my mother said, that doesn't matter, you have to thank her. So I asked my sister Mimi, did she want to look at the book? And she said, sure, and I sent her a copy. And after a while, she said, I realized I would really rather make beads than read your book. So she's amazing. She's very talented crafts and art. And she was making beads, glass, taking the glass tubes, firing up a torch and melting them into beads. She said, so I'll give you a necklace of beads that I made. And I loved it. It made me just as happy as my other sister reading this stuff. But she was not happy with how I presented my mother. She pointed out certain things, specific things that were unfair, and I changed them. And I was very nervous when the piece came out in the Washington Post because her friends were going to see it. But she told me she liked it, and she liked it better than the way I presented my mother in the book. So she did not at all hold it against me, but she did have that different perspective.
Thank you.
Suzanne?
Yeah, hi. I did read the piece in the Post, and it's interesting. You say that you felt that your father would have done better with Helen. Now, if I remember,
I thought that before. As I said in the Post, I changed my mind.
Yeah, okay. But then your father, can you comment on the idea? Because I didn't understand it completely, the idea that your father felt that in the end he had made the right choice.
My father did not say one way or the other whether he had made the right choice.
Okay.
The way he talked about it was, he felt he could not marry. He was supporting his mother and sister and barely managing to do it. It was still the Depression, 1933. He never said he liked Helen better. He said, I liked her. She was very nice. And I asked him several times, and I quote, I have it on tape, so I quoted in the book. I tried to ask him, well, which one did you like better? If you knew you had to marry somebody, which one would you choose? And he would never say, and my father was very diplomatic, and I don't think he would have said it, but what he always said was, I didn't want to marry anyone. I wanted to find them both good husbands. And part of the reason was he felt responsible for supporting his mother and sister. He thought they would come to a terrible end if he didn't. And he had this dream that he would be free, that they would get married and some other man would have to take care of them. And he would travel. He would live in different countries and learn the language in each one, which I was stunned was my dream. I got as far as Greece. I had never heard him say that, but it was the same dream that I had. Yeah, so that's what he said. So he never said that he liked one or the other better.
I misunderstood. But
now,
it did
something very interesting. His journals are full of my mother and not a mention of Helen. And I don't know what to make of that. I think probably you write about things that you're bothering you, and a lot of the stuff about my mother is complaints.
Yeah.
Because they were working in the same office and she was kind of after him. And my mother said that too. I quote her saying that. She said, I was so aggressive. I can't believe how aggressive I was. I was always after him to take me to lunch and take me to dinner. So maybe that's why. I don't know.
Yeah. Thanks. I just misunderstood, I guess.
I wasn't clear enough.
Sure.
And what I end up coming to the terms, and not the bit about virginity, that's a whole interesting story, but my father spent all his free time in my mother's house. She had 3 older brothers. One of them was his best friend. They became best friends because he worked in the same factory that my father did when they were both 14. They came to this country, immediately went to work in this factory, and they immediately became good friends. And so my father and his situation with his mother and sister was extremely unhappy. I do not put this in any of the books, but his sister was mentally ill. And the situation at home was extremely unpleasant. His mother was definitely challenging. So he spent all his time in my mother's house. And I think in a way he adopted her family as a substitute for his own.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a way his marrying my mother was kind of a fait accompli. It was because of that. And I didn't understand until I wrote the book, and I suspect this is true for many immigrants. Part of the reason he spoke with such nostalgia of his life in Warsaw, he was part of this big family. Yeah. And suddenly, instead of this, extended family, aunts and uncles and loving grandmother and grandfather, not so loving, but, it's reduced to just 3. My father, his troubled sister, and his miserable mother. Again, from reading the letters and journals, I could see she was clinically depressed. She spent the whole day lying on the couch, never combed her hair, never changed her dress. She was depressed. And I'm not surprised. And again, I'm sure many immigrants find this from having had this, role in life in Poland to not being able to work, supported by a teenage son. So I think it was inevitable that he would end up with my mother. And I'm here.
Yeah.
Martha?
So I have a few questions, but I don't want to hog the floor. So, while I have the floor, I'll just say if people want to use the raise hand function, it's actually under reactions, not participants. So one of the things about the book, it was interesting that you talk about the structure, because it took me a little while to figure out what was going on. And then I felt like you were drawing there was more and more depth in something you were figuring out, and you were drawing the reader into it. So it was sort of like like a spiral or an onion, something like that. And where I came to, and maybe it was my own projections, is I felt like some healing happened between you and your mother as you figured out the story of your father and Helen and your mother, and how maybe she really was the better partner after all.
Yeah, I can't say at all what would be better, because I honestly don't know what kind of wife Helen would have been. But yeah, in an early draft, I had a lot of terrible stuff about my mother. My mother was difficult. She also was depressed all the time. She was always angry at my father. He was very loving toward her. She was not so loving toward him. She had a very coarse manner, as her brothers did too. She was always saying, "What? What are you talking about?" I never heard my father raise his voice. I never heard him say a harsh word. But she did love him. Absolutely no question that she loved him. And but yeah, there's a story I tell. She was what I considered manipulative. I mean, she kind of tricked my father into marrying her by saying, the story is he wouldn't sleep with a woman who was a virgin because then he'd have to marry her, and he knew we couldn't get married. So my mother was not a virgin. She said he wouldn't be obligated. And then she changed her mind and decided, we've been having sex, we better get married. And she got sick and she took to her bed and she was crying morning till night. And he felt terrible for her. So he said, okay, let's get married. When I read that, when I learned that, both my parents told me that, by the way. That was, again, there were not a lot of secrets in my family. My mother told me that that's how it happened too. There was a big drama in my life. I was supposed to go to the Peace Corps. I was accepted to go to the Peace Corps and go to Thailand. I was living in Greece. When I learned that I was accepted in the Peace Corps, I came back from Greece in order to go in the Peace Corps. I shopped. I, had a job making money, but, to save some money. But I was actually helping Norman Mailer revise his play off Broadway, and there'd be a thing during the rehearsals during the day. Norman Mailer would rewrite it, and then I would retype it. But I would come home every day from that job. My mother would greet me at the door with her eyes red and swollen from crying because she was so upset that I was going to go to the Peace Corps. And my father described it the same way, that she, with this, this horrible misery and the eyes swollen red from crying, she threatened. If I went in the Peace Corps, I was 21. By the time I came out, I'd be 23, and there'd be nobody left to marry because all the marriageable boys would have gotten married while I was in the Peace Corps. Another was I would be shot by a stray bullet from the Vietnam War. And it wore me down. And the night before I was supposed to go, I called the Peace Corps and said, I'm not going. And immediately regretted it. And I ended up going back to Greece. And when I did that, she said, if I'd known you were going to go back to Greece, I would have let you go in the Peace Corps. So there were reasons I was critical of my mother. However, when I was unmarried, I was the source of all my mother's misery, but I had a first marriage to a Greek, and then 11 years that I was single, during which my mother was utterly miserable, and it was all my fault because I wasn't married. And then at 40, I got married again, and so then she wasn't upset with me anymore. And the older she got, we were very close, and we had a really good relationship, and I loved her, and she was very loving to me, and she wrote me love letters, and I sent her gifts, and I write about that in my book, You're Wearing That. She did always think my hair was too long. So I did come to love her. But yes, you're right, that there's a lot more about my mother than I ended up with. Again, an editor went through many, many rewrites. An editor pointed out that all this negative stuff about my mother really didn't help the book any, and she was right. So I took it out. But you sensed it.
Well, you know, we grew up in the same milieu, so.
Yeah, the thing about my mother is so fascinating. I had really thought, this was in psychology here now, I guess, I thought of her as being manipulative. I think she was genuinely unhappy. I don't think she pretended to be utterly miserable. She was. And I think she had this fear of separation, and maybe from her own wartime trauma, because she had to escape from Russia to Poland. They were led through the forest by a Polish farmer during the night. She was 9 years old. Her mother lost her shoe in the snow and couldn't stop to get it, and so got frostbite in her toes. My mother had memory of waking up, of hiding in a cellar all night and waking up in the morning and seeing dead bodies on the street. It was probably a war and not a pogrom. But anyway, she had reasons that she had reasons for being unhappy.
I saw two people raise. Oh, Richard, sorry.
Thank you. On the theme of writing for non-academic audiences, and at about chapter 5 in your book, I have a question. I guess the question simply is, are there things that your editor foo-fooed or said don't belong? And I'll give you an example. The stuff you wrote about the conversations between your mom and your dad on the phone, where you seemed very tuned into their linguistic style, conversational style. Your father would be a storyteller, and you would like to hear about that. Your mother had a very different style on the phone. And I don't know if that's the example, but it illustrates my question is, were there things that your editor said, this is just a little bit too analytical, a little bit too academic for the audience?
Yes, as I told you, editors always, if they didn't like something, they would say it's too academic. Nobody mentioned that to me, but yes, early on, I did have examples, not so much a conversation between my parents. Everybody seemed to like the conversations where I got their voices, but
I did.
But when I had examples of my father's writing and examples from the letters that I tended to analyze the way I do, you know, his use of this word was blah, 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 and his use of this, and an editor did tell me to cut that out, and I did. So sometimes I was guilty of being too academic.
Right, but
there were other things. The editor didn't want me to keep all the chapter on the sisters, but I just felt that was just too important. What I did was take out the brothers.
okay.
My earlier draft, I had every sibling, what happened to them, and I realized, okay, the brothers aren't that interesting, but I kept the sisters. Also, I have a bit about my father's sex life. And when he gave me his journals, he said, you can have this one now, and you can have this one after I'm gone. It'll be here. And eventually he gave that one to me too, and he told me what was in it. It had an account of his first sexual experience with a prostitute. And I mean, it was heartbreaking. He felt horrible for the prostitute. She was kept like in a closet under a staircase where the elevator operator was collecting the money. It was awful. And I thought it was revealing of the times, that this is both her situation, his sympathy for her. He was shocked he had never seen a naked woman. I've read this about other people too. He was shocked at women's anatomy. He was he was very clever and very funny and wry, and he said something about how he wished that the maker had used better judgment in designing women. But I went back and forth. It was in, it was out, it was in, it was out. And then finally people might be offended by it, and I left it out.
Okay. We got 4 more questions. Carol, can you
Sure. I really enjoyed the book, Dr. Tannen, and I'm enjoying this discussion. And a question I have is, when we were growing up, it took a while for parents to begin to talk to us about the Holocaust and about the family members who were lost. But your father talked to you so much about so much. And I wonder when it was when you became aware of the Holocaust and the family members who were lost.
That is a wonderful question. Of course, my father's experience was not a Holocaust experience. He left in 1920. And he did not lose a lot of relatives. He lost the grandfather, died in the Warsaw ghetto. His grandmother had already passed away, and only one uncle was left. The youngest brother, because he was a Hasid, he's the only one who remained Hasidic, but because of that, he wouldn't come to America, and he had a wife and 5 children that were killed in the camps. But no, my father did not talk about it, and it. When did I feel like I always knew about it, but and of course we went to Poland together and went to Auschwitz, and I went there myself when I visited Poland. But there was not a lot of talk about it, and it's one of the things that I talked to him so many hours, endless hours, and every day I think of things I wish I had asked him, and that's one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Ed Lebo?
Hi, I wanted to ask you a question about editors. I was fascinated to hear you talk in the one episode of a single book, running through a whole bunch of them. But of course, over your remarkable career, you've encountered a lot of different editor styles and people to work with. Can you comment some on what style of editor work do you find
can you believe
works best for you?
Yeah, I've had, I guess, 7 general audience books, I think, something like that. I only had the same editor on 2 books. That's not what I meant, and you just didn't understand. And she was kind of difficult. The one who said, "Don't, the people will think your book is cotton candy. You're much too smart." She had a way of twisting a knife. But for some various reasons, I've had a different editor with every book, and I've missed that. I read about writers who had a relationship with an editor. I liked them all, except I had a problem with one who really wanted me to write a self-help book. That every anecdote I gave where there was a problem, I should tell what would have been better and how they could fix it. And I added a few, but not nearly as many as she wanted. But all the editors I've had have been editors, and I know I've heard that people say editors don't do that anymore, but they all did read drafts and tell me where they thought things could be improved. That first experience where there was no changes, that was unusual. I have to say, there was a point with You Just Don't Understand, of course, that I was a big deal. I'm not a big deal anymore. My last book about friends didn't sell very well. The one before that about sisters didn't sell very well, although it was on the bestseller list for a week. And so the last few books, I got a less powerful editor with each book. And this last one, I liked the editor that I had with my book about friends, the previous one. And I was all ready to send her the manuscript of this book, and she's gone. And they told me they have a new editor for me. I'm sure you'll love her. And she called me, and she had no idea who I was, that I had ever written another book before. She was 26 years old. She was from North Dakota. She had been an editor for about 6 weeks. And I thought, how on earth is she going to edit a book like this? But it really was, I'm not Deborah Tannen anymore, not the way I was. And that's been, an adjustment. But my agent was able to go back to the publisher and get another editor who had a little more experience, happened to be Jewish, from New York. She said my father reminded her of her grandmother. She had to go that far back, but she was good. And I was pleased with her, and she made a lot of comments that were helpful. Twice I sent what I thought was a final draft, and turned out it wasn't. And she was right. It didn't, I think. At every stage, she wanted me to put more of myself in. I started out thinking, this is a biography of my father. It's not a memoir. But it became sort of a memoir because I kept adding more about myself. She kept writing in the margin, how did this make you feel? And I thought, what is this, therapy? But I think she was right, that people wanted to know, see the relationship. I don't know, does that answer your question?
John Mason has had his hand up for a long time. John, do you still have a question? You have to unmute.
Hi, thank you, Suzanne. I am loving this, Deborah. I'm a New Yorker. Part of my family is Jewish, and I'm not. But I'm wondering about the whole question of a conversation about the language of being Jewish. And I know there's a whole Yiddish background to this, but whether you've ever considered something along those lines.
Yes, thank you. I do have a chapter on that. The chapter is entitled, I Feel Like a Jew. I asked my father, do you feel more Polish or more American? And he said, I feel like a Jew. He was an atheist. He was not an agnostic. He was a devout atheist. He believed that religion is the opium of the people. But he was very, very Jewish, very aware of Jewish, very proud of being Jewish. Felt you had to be proud of being Jewish or else you're going to be ashamed of it. And he suffered antisemitism far more than I did. And more, again, he didn't talk about it a lot. But you know, like when I graduated college, I got a job at Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, and I came home and announced I got this job, and he just said very quietly, yeah, well, in my time they didn't hire Jews, but most other companies didn't either. The story of his, the big regret of his life, anti-Semitism plays a role there too, so maybe I'll tell you, but quickly about the Yiddish. The older he got, the more Yiddish he spoke. And so he died 2.5 years after my mother did, and I spent a lot of time with him. And he had a Yiddish expression for everything. And I would write it down. He didn't have an accent that I could hear because he came at 12. But I think his humor is very Jewish. I mean, people say that the first early chapter, I have a lot of the funny things that he said, like he was very, very quick. Every time I called, he'd be lying down because this assisted living place that he lived, the bed was right next to the desk. He'd spend his time at the desk and then he'd see the bed and he'd go lie down. And he said if it wasn't right there, he wouldn't lie down. Anyway, he did. And I would say, Daddy, you can't lie down all day. I'd call, what are you doing? He always started a phone call. What am I interrupting? So I did that with him. What am I interrupting? Oh, I'm just lying down. You can't lie down you can't lie in bed all day. He would say, well, I'm practicing. I'm going to be under the ground for a long time. Or another time he said, I said, what are you doing? Oh, I'm lying in bed looking at the ceiling. You can't look at the ceiling all day. Well, sometimes I get up and look at the floor. Or my favorite, he never had dementia. He always was with it, but he did have a lot of memory loss. So he would forget things. So I arrived one day and he was thrilled to see me, but he was surprised. And I said, but Daddy, I talk to you every day. And I told you I'll be there in 7 days. I'll be there in 6 days. I'll be there in 5 days. And he said, well, no wonder I forgot. You keep changing it. So his humor, I think, was very Jewish. The thing, I'll tell you the quick story about anti-Semitism. The big regret of his life, During the Depression, you know, he was really hard to find steady work, but he could not take time off to establish a law practice because he was supporting his family. So at this point, it was my older sister, my mother, and her mother, and giving some money to his mother. He always gave some money to his mother and sister. But he got an offer to be a prison guard in the federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut. He did not apply to be a prison guard. He had taken a federal civil service exam. And the way he put it, he took so many exams, he lost track, and so did everybody else. But now it was 1941, things were beginning to open up a bit. This was a brand new prison, and he was offered a job as a guard. So he took it. They went to Danbury. They were very happy there. They were part of a community. I don't think I totally understood this, that was part of why they were so happy there. They lived in a house, not an ugly New York apartment building. He liked the work. My sister loved her school. But then he gets a notice that he got promoted to parole officer very quickly. Then he got another notice, another civil service exam offering him a job as a alcohol tax inspector. This was Prohibition. He's making, was it $50 a week as a guard, 6 days a week, and this is going to be $12 a week more. So obviously it was a lot more money, and he felt he had to take it. Whether he would like it, whether the family would be happy, that doesn't enter into it. It's all about supporting the family. So he goes to tell the warden that he got offered this job and he's taking it. And the warden is very upset. He tells him, don't do that. You are going to be a warden. And he says, no, there's no way that a Jew will be a warden. There's not a single Jewish warden in the whole system. And the warden said, that's because there were no Jews in the system. But this will not be an impediment. You will be a warden in a year. It turns out the warden knew something that he wasn't able to tell. And my father didn't believe it, and he took the job. The job didn't work out. They moved to Providence, Rhode Island. My mother gets pregnant with me. She doesn't want to have the baby in a city where she doesn't know anybody. They didn't make any friends. They didn't know any other Jews. The job was fine, but you know, my mother was unhappy. And they come back to New York, and then he has no way to support himself. He goes back to the factory. And he gets very active in politics, Liberal Party politics, which is to the left of the Democrats, because they're promising that he'll get a political appointment next year, and it's 13 years that he's a cutter in the garment district till he gets a political appointment. Assistant counsel to the Workmen's Compensation Board. Meanwhile, a year into this, they go visit their friends in Danbury, and the friend who got the job that he got as parole officer when he left, a year later became warden. That warden that he knew was promoted to the head of something else in Washington, and apparently he knew that was coming, which is why he was saying to my father, you'll be a warden in a year. And that friend was Jewish. So that was this terrible regret, the 13 years that he worked in that factory, knowing he was a lawyer and feeling that everybody must have contempt for him, that he obviously couldn't cut it as a lawyer. So that was his big regret. But why do I say anti-Semitism is a part of it? I mentioned my father was a communist. I have his FBI file. And from the file, sometimes I have the thing to point this out. It's almost all blacked out. I don't know if I can find it too easily, but I'll flip pages while I talk to you. But the one thing that was in the FBI file that I could read, it was an interview. I say interview. He was called in and questioned twice. And in that interview, he says, I don't know why anybody would think that I was a communist, except at the prison, and he was denounced by somebody at the prison. He says at the prison, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. He said there was a lot of resentment because he got the promotion to parole officer. And he said there were a lot of guards that were very anti-Semitic. And it turned, I hadn't even realized this. They talked about these friends they had in the community they were part of. It was a small group of New York Jews who were a minority there. Here's what a page looks like from his FBI file. It's all blacked out. But there was one that said the interviews with him were left there. So it made me understand why he would have made that decision, why he would have thought that they would never, a Jew would never be warden.
Wow. Well, it's almost 8:30. There is one question in the chat, Dr. Tannen. Shall we go for it?
Let me look at it here. I'm starting a project on father-son communication for a non-academic audience. Given my training, it will be grounded in sociolinguistics. Goffman, yeah, Bateson. What 2-3 sources would you suggest drawing on as I think through the methodology, either from your work or someone else, Richard Morris? I'm not familiar with any work on father-son communication. And I have to say that even for my book on sisters, I didn't read a lot of academic research on sisters. I mean, I read a few papers that I had found. There was a dissertation written that I found, but I had come around to just talking to people. When I started out, I never did interviews. That was anathema to me. I just tape recorded naturally occurring conversation, transcribed it. That's what I studied. But over time, I did soften toward that, and I would interview people and see what they could tell me about their lives. So that would be my thought, to talk to people about fathers and sons and their communication. I also read every memoir I could find by a daughter about her father, and there were a lot. But yeah, I can't say that I anything about methodology or studies about that come to mind.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I don't know if Suzanne also wants to give thanks on behalf of WAPA as a whole, but I do want to say I'm thrilled, and you just gave us so much tonight. I wish I could remember what your last words were with Shankar Vedantam the other day. There's something about the way you see people, something about the positive nature of people, and
Oh yeah. I said, mine is a rhetoric of good intentions. That people say to me, that I always try to see everybody's style as well-intentioned, and try to see why when people are having a misunderstanding, both are well-intentioned, and it's just a conversational style difference. And people do say to me, well, what if people have bad intentions? And I say, well, that's not news. People are very quick to think other people have bad intentions. It's the realization that they might have good intentions, but a different conversational style, and that the world is a more welcoming place to live in if you take that approach. Is that what you have in mind?
yeah, exactly. It's
Kind of a riff, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's great. Very needed. Well, thank you again, Suzanne.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Deborah. It felt like we were sitting having coffee. It was just personal. This was wonderful. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And thank you all who left your cameras on so that I was talking to you.
And I wanted to remind WAPA members, including you, Deborah, if you'd like to participate, that next month we're having the game night, let's call it, because usually in June we don't have a meeting, we have an outing, we have a field trip somewhere, but we can't do that this year. So instead, Monica's figured out a way that we can have fun on Zoom. Imagine that. I can't imagine such a thing, but Monica's gonna show us.
We'll try.
So thanks to everybody for coming. It's great to see faces that I haven't seen in a while. And thank you again, Deborah. Thanks, Martha, for putting this together for us.
It was my pleasure. It was fun. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to say good night to everyone, and see you again soon, I hope.
Right.